I'm so thrilled and honored to be part of this festival and to be in this beautiful country and to hear these works premiered. Not only my own, but also the works of all of these other amazing composers that they've invited. And it's really going to be an incredible, beautiful week of music and critique. And so I really hope that you'll be able to attend. It will be held in Bled at various locations from the 26th of June through the 30th. And so I hope that you'll be able to join us. Zdravo! My name is Darcy Copeland, and I am a composer of contemporary and electroacoustic music, and I am based in the United States. I would describe my compositional style as eclectic and discovery-based. What I mean by that is that I utilize a lot of techniques in my works, such as attention to timbre, texture. I use microtonality without necessarily subscribing to the processes associated with those techniques historically. So spectralism, for example, early on I was very influenced by the sort of aesthetics of spectralism. But when I use those aesthetics in my own work, I'm not necessarily using them in the same way that they were used historically. Rather, I'm sort of taking those aesthetics and those techniques and adapting them to whatever the piece is demanding at that moment. I will say that there tends to be a consistent exploration of texture in my work, and so I tend to think of harmony as texture, and my use of harmonic language is not necessarily the sort of usual structure, but rather I sort of consider the densities of harmonies and the sort of textural palpations of those harmonies, and that's how I use my harmonic language. I approach the process of composing as very open and involving a lot of listening to the world, and also listening to the piece itself, and sort of cultivating a dialogue between myself and the piece that I'm working on. And oftentimes the piece, I'll think that it's going in one direction or that I want it to go in one direction, but then the material, as I'm writing, as I'm working, it so clearly wants to do something else. And a lot of times I find friction in those moments. And so the process of composing has become one of listening and being open and being adaptable and creating this dialogue. I try to balance creativity and technicality in my compositions by taking a physical approach first. So as much as possible, I love to get my hands on an instrument and see what is possible and try to imagine how would I want to see this when it comes to notating, that is. And so I try not to allow myself to be limited by thinking too much about how will this be notated, how will this be executed, but I try to approach the compositional process from a more tactile, sort of discovery-based way of exploring sounds. I don't know that I have any particular rituals or routines, but I do tend to work best in the morning time. So I guess my routine is really just my morning routine where I wake up and I make coffee, and depending on how much time I have and how early it is, I like to read a bit. And then after, 20 minutes of reading or so, that's when I usually will sit down at my desk and start the process. But I will say that another important ritual that I don't necessarily do all that regularly, but just whenever the need arises, is getting outside and getting into nature. I think that's really important for any creative person. I think, I go on a walk to the park near me where there's an urban forest, and I love walking down that trail and just watching the way that the light dapples through the trees and listening to all of the different intricate little sounds that happen in those spaces. And I think that nature provides just such a wealth of opportunity and possibility that is undoubtedly inspiring. When I run into challenges or obstacles in the process, usually my first line of defense is to, again, go into nature, take a walk, try to get a fresh perspective, because so often I run into the issue of just getting so almost too involved, too within the piece, that I lose the ability to see it from the outside. And that really warps my perception. And so one of the first things I try to do is get away. And the next thing I do is I tend to lean on my partner, who is also a composer and pianist, and whose opinion I value greatly, and have talk with him through the challenges that I'm facing, and to get just outside opinions from him, and also from my mentors, who always offer such an incredible and fresh perspective, and oftentimes, leave me seeing the piece in an entirely new light. What motivates me to create music is, and always has been, curiosity. I've always just found the sonic world so compelling, because it transcends, it's not just oral, it's also physical. And it has physical implications on our bodies, on the world, and it's so immersive. It's a completely different way of experiencing the world than the sort of visual-centric way that Western culture has sort of dominated. And I think that it's just so interesting, and the immersiveness of it just creates so many opportunities for just experiencing new things and thinking things in a different way and experiencing them as well in real time. I think that the experience of listening collectively is really powerful, and I think that it can, because of its sort of subjectivity, it can really open new pathways for understanding and experience. I think art is always involved with society, and while I don't necessarily think that artists have necessarily responsibilities or obligations to anything other than their vision, I do think that art is always inherently political, just through the act of performing it, creating it, choosing a life and choosing a way of being in the world that doesn't subscribe to the sort of dominant and oppressive ways that we've been sort of conditioned to. And I think that art is always involved in society in that way, and it's always critiquing, and it's always a response, and it's always a dialogue. And I know that personally in my work, especially in recent years, I've been very much concerned with social critique in my works. Particularly because sound is so immersive and effective. And I mean that as an affect, like it is physically effectual to the body and therefore the mind. I think that it's a really powerful tool to thinking in new ways and experiencing things in new ways. And so I've personally been really concerned with introducing sort of ecological ways of thinking into my works and bringing those sorts of new ways of being in the world to the forefront. The first person who comes to mind is my mentor, Gaya. Her music and her approach to music has been very inspirational and influential to me ever since I discovered her music several years ago now, and now also her direct guidance is very influential to me in my work. I also think Hildegard von Bingen is a very influential figure for me. I listen to her pretty frequently, pretty regularly, and I mean just that era of music generally I just found so beautiful. I just love the polyphony and tried to implement that in my work today as much as possible. And also Hildegard as a human is so interesting to me because I feel like we, as artists, we tend to think that we have to sort of zero in on whatever it is we decide to make our thing. And I just love that, Hildegard von Bingen, she was not just a musician, she was also a healer and a gardener and, and very spiritual, and she was all of these things, and so these sort of multiplicities are very inspiring to me. So I have 3 pieces being featured as part of this summer festival, which I'm very excited about. 2 of them are newly composed works. One of them was written explicitly for the abeceda ensemble, and will be premiered on Monday, the 26th, at Bled Castle. And that piece is called Wolf, and it is for string trio, harp, alto saxophone, and electronics. And this piece was challenging for me to write, but I'm so excited about how it's going to turn out, and I'm so thrilled to hear it for the first time with all of you. And the next piece is another newly composed work for solo cello and electronics called Contaminant. And both of these pieces are motivated by this desire to bring sort of ecological ways of being and ways of thinking and experiencing the world to the forefront. And so in Wolf, I wanted to sort of explore my lifelong fascination with the animal and all that it represents. It has all of these multiplicities. In many indigenous cultures, wolves are seen as protectors and as mothers even, and seers, and they're seen as wise and creators, and they're treated with reverence. And at the same time, they're predators, and they have been perceived as such throughout much of human history. And we see, comparisons of lone wolf and the wolf pack and all of these sort of descriptors of human behavior with these negative connotations of the wolf. And so I wanted to sort of interrogate all of these identities that exist in this one being, and what it represents to us, and what those representations really say about human nature. Really, I want the audience at some point to become the wolf. And so we'll see what happens in the premiere. But Contaminant is another piece that's concerned with ecology and climate destruction. I wanted to explore the violence of change, and also the fact that there is something new that always comes from destruction, and that creation itself is a destructive process. And so, I think that with climate change narratives, it's very often apocalyptic, and rightfully so. But I wanted to sort of interrogate the possibility of what can be created or cultivated out of all this destruction, out of all of this violence. And so I create this really visceral sound world that the cello has to navigate and react to, and I think that it ends in a really beautiful place, and perhaps a haunted place, but I think there can be beauty in it nonetheless. The third piece will be a piece that I composed back in 2021 called Bled 1, Aporia. And that piece was very personal for me to write. It was inspired by Maggie Nelson's book called Bluets, which is about depression and a sort of literal and metaphorical love and sort of compulsion towards the color blue. And I wanted to sort of explore my own experience with these themes in this piece. And I don't think I want to say too much more about that. Other than that, the piece hasn't been publicly performed yet. It's been recorded, but hasn't been publicly performed, so this is actually going to be yet another premiere, which I'm very excited about. I was very excited about the instrumentation that I was given to work with. I always loved working with string instruments. As primarily a cellist myself, that's something that tends to come more naturally to me, and my ideas tend to be more easily conveyed through string instruments. But I am also so thrilled to have written for the saxophone and the harp, which are two of my favorite instruments. So this is really an exciting time for me, and I'm really excited to hear this piece brought to life. I think that the harp is a challenging instrument to write for, or it can be, but it has so much possibility and so much beauty, and also raucousness in it that it has so many potentials that I was so excited to explore in this piece. My early musical education was pretty hands-off. I didn't really have formal music lessons until pretty late in life, when I was in high school. And my family was not musical or artistic in the slightest. And so I think that, my approach to sound was very much my own, which sometimes felt like a hindrance, but now I've come to see as a strength, that I was able to sort of carve out my own path towards sound making and discovery. And my approach today is still very much influenced by that sort of inclination towards physical discovery and tactility. I did start singing at a young age, without necessarily any sort of formal training for a while, but that's something that I always loved and was, I loved making sounds and I loved singing and just expressing myself in this way, in this very physical and embodied way. And so I think that was very deeply influential on me as well. I didn't know that I would become a composer until I was already in college. I knew that I was always pulled towards music, but I had never experienced contemporary music until, experimental concert music, until I was already in college. It was my second semester that I was really exposed to that world, but I went into college as a vocal performance major because I knew I was pulled towards music, and I felt, compelled because I'd always loved the voice, I'd always loved singing, but there was something that was missing for me. And with the encouragement of some friends and professors, I took my first composition class, and immediately it was a whole world opened for me, and I haven't looked back since. I do think that children should be introduced to contemporary music early on, and I think that the way to do that is through just allowing them to explore, allowing them to experiment, and obviously it's good to learn rules and it's good to learn histories, but I think that music education is so regimented and controlled that I think it stifles creativity a lot of times, and it creates this sort of way of thinking that it has to be a certain way. And I think that we should open up a bit more and put a little more faith in the capabilities of children and their imagination and their willingness to experiment, and just allow that freedom. So I don't know much about Slovenia, but I do know that Ljubljana is considered the city of dragons, which is really exciting. I wore my dragons in preparation, and so I'm really excited to just explore this beautiful country, and particularly the national park. It's so beautiful from the pictures that I've seen, and I'm so excited to explore and just get to know this city, this country, and the culture and the nature. I first found out about abeceda ensemble over the pandemic. So in 2021, I participated in their precept, concept, percept workshop, which was happening online. And I was living in Seattle at the time, so I actually, for the whole week that the workshop was happening, I woke up at 5 a.m. every morning for a week to be able to meet at the same time as everyone else. And it was really great, and I was so excited to meet all of these incredible composers and performers. And that's when I was working with Urban on my cello piece, Bled, and he recorded it, and it was such a wonderful experience, and I'm so honored to have been invited to be a composer in residence with them, and to be coming to their country to work with them and to be a part of this festival. I'm really excited and really humbled.